The winter of 2000 didn't just bring snow. It brought a bitter, bone-chilling frost that seemed to freeze the very air inside your lungs. My name is Eleanor. For 10 years, my life had been defined by a quiet, echoing emptiness. My husband, Arthur, and I lived in a sprawling, historic colonial home in the suburbs, a house with 5 bedrooms, a manicured lawn, and an abundance of space that felt less like luxury and more like a monument to what we lacked. We were wealthy, successful, and entirely childless. After 4 failed IVF cycles and a devastating miscarriage that nearly cost me my life, the doctors told us the door was closed. Arthur handled the grief by burying himself in his architectural firm. I handled mine by throwing myself into charity work, managing a food distribution program at the downtown community center. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before Christmas, when I first saw him. The wind was howling outside, rattling the heavy glass doors of the center. Most of the people lined up for warm soup were familiar faces, but sitting alone on a plastic crate near the radiator was a boy who couldn't have been older than 10. He didn't have a coat. He wore a faded, oversized denim jacket with frayed cuffs, and his hands were tucked deep into his pockets to keep from shaking. Despite his circumstances, his eyes weren't defeated. They were a striking, piercing gray, incredibly sharp and lively, darting around the room with an intense curiosity. "Hey there," I said, walking over with a steaming bowl of beef stew and a thick slice of sourdough bread. "You look like you're freezing." The boy looked up. He didn't snatch the food like most starving kids would. Instead, he gave me a remarkably polite, dimpled smile. "Thank you, ma'am. The radiator helps, but the stew looks better." His name was Leo. Over the next 2 weeks, Leo became my shadow at the center. I learned that his mother had passed a year ago, and he had been drifting through the broken gears of the state's foster care system before running away from a volatile group home. He was incredibly dynamic. He didn't just sit around. He helped me stack crates, organize the pantry, and could calculate the inventory numbers in his head faster than I could type them into my iPad. There was an invisible string drawing me to this boy. Every time I looked into his gray eyes, a profound, maternal instinct slammed against my chest. "Arthur, I want to bring him home," I announced that Friday evening over dinner. Arthur paused, his steak knife hovering over his plate. He was a handsome man in his early 40s, with a sharp jawline and a meticulously styled head of dark hair. He was usually the embodiment of calm, but the moment the words left my mouth, his entire demeanor shifted. His posture went completely rigid. "An adoption, Eleanor?" "Now?" Arthur asked, his voice tight, dangerously controlled. "We agreed at the visit that we were moving past this. We were going to focus on us. He's living in a temporary youth shelter, Arthur. He's 10 years old, brilliant, and completely alone." I pleaded, leaning across the table. "I'm not talking about a baby. I'm talking about saving a life. Just meet him, please." Arthur didn't look at me. He stared down at his plate, his jaw clenching so tightly I could see the muscle twitching under his skin. "No. The answer is no. I won't have a stranger's child disrupting our lives because of a sudden wave of guilt." It was the first time in our 12-year marriage that Arthur had been so fiercely, inexplicably cold about a charity case. But the pushback only fueled my resolve. I couldn't leave Leo behind. Using my family's legal connections and my own clean record, I bypassed Arthur's resistance by applying for an emergency temporary foster guardianship under my individual name. Because of the overcrowding in the winter shelters, the state approved the dynamic plan. On Christmas Eve, the garage door opened, and I brought Leo into our home. He carried his entire life in a single canvas backpack. As he stepped into the grand, brightly lit foyer, his gray eyes widened, taking in the towering Christmas tree and the elegant winding staircase. He looked small, fragile, but completely captivated. "Arthur," I called out, leading Leo toward the warmth of the living room fireplace. "We're here." Arthur walked down the stairs slowly. He was wearing a high-collared black cashmere sweater, looking every bit the wealthy architect. His face was an emotionless mask as he reached the bottom step. "Leo, this is my husband, Arthur," I said, placing a proud hand on Leo's shoulder. Leo stepped forward, extending his small, calloused hand with that same polite, dimpled smile. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Vance." Arthur stopped dead in his tracks, 3 feet away from the boy. The moment his eyes locked, the color drained from Arthur's skin so fast he looked like a ghost. He didn't reach out to shake the boy's hand. Instead, his gaze dropped to the child's dynamic stance, then traveled back up to those piercing gray eyes. Arthur's chest heaved once, a sudden, panicked breath escaping his lips. "Arthur," I asked, a faint tremor of unease rippling through me. "Are you okay?" Arthur didn't answer me. He stared at Leo, as if he were looking at an apparition rising from the grave. Without saying a single word of welcome, Arthur abruptly turned on his heel, walked straight past us, and slammed the door of his private study behind him. The false truth of our perfect, charitable holiday had just cracked. I looked down at Leo, who had lowered his hand, his dynamic smile fading into a look of quiet confusion. I didn't know it yet, but my act of kindness hadn't just brought a homeless boy into our house. It had just unlocked the front door to a terrifying old architecture of lies. Video 21. The birthmark on the skin. Chapter 2. The uncanny mirror. The echo of Arthur's study door slamming shut seemed to vibrate through the entire house for a long, agonizing interval. I stood there in the grand foyer, my hand still resting on Leo's small shoulder, feeling an icy knot of embarrassment and confusion tighten in my stomach. "I'm sorry, Leo," I whispered, forcing a warm smile as I looked down at him. "Mr. Vance has been under an immense amount of stress with his firm lately. It has nothing to do with you." Leo looked up at me, his piercing gray eyes incredibly calm, displaying a maturity that no 10-year-old boy should ever possess. "It's okay, Eleanor. People in big houses usually don't like surprises. I'm used to it." That night, I set Leo up in the guest bedroom on the second floor. It was a beautiful room, bathed in the soft blue glow of the outdoor snow reflections. As crisp linen sheets, he looked so small, yet his presence in our home felt monumental. When I finally entered our master bedroom, Arthur was already in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. The room was dark, saved only by the ambient moonlight. "Arthur, what was that downstairs?" I asked, my voice laced with a sharp, active investigation. I walked over to his side of the bed. "You treated that boy like he was a monster. He is a child. A homeless child on Christmas Eve." Arthur didn't turn his head to look at me. His jaw was locked into a rigid concrete line. "I told you, Eleanor. I didn't want this. You forced this placement into our house without my consent. You can't expect me to play the happy father. I don't expect you to be a father overnight." I snapped, the frustration of our years of emptiness boiling over. "I expect you to be a human being." Arthur turned away from me, pulling the heavy duvet over his shoulder. The silence that followed was suffocating, but the real terror until the following morning. On Christmas Day, the tension in the house was palpable. I spent the morning in the kitchen, preparing a traditional roast. Leo, being the dynamic boy he was, refused to sit idle. He stood on a small step stool next to the marble island, helping me chop herbs. "I like the smell of rosemary," Leo said, his gray eyes lighting up as he worked. "But I don't like it when it touches tomatoes. It ruins the taste." I froze, the carving knife stopping midair. Arthur hated rosemary on tomatoes. It was a highly specific, almost absurd culinary quirk that he had complained about for 12 years. I dismissed it as a bizarre coincidence. An hour later, Arthur finally crawled out of his study, desperately seeking a cup of black coffee. He walked into the kitchen, his eyes meticulously avoiding the corner where Leo was sitting. Leo, trying to be polite, immediately hopped down from the stool. As he did, he reached for his glass of orange juice on the counter, but his hand slipped. The crystal glass tumbled over, pouring the bright orange liquid straight across the pristine, white marble island. "Oh, I'm sorry," Leo cried out. Instantly, without thinking, the boy didn't grab a towel. Instead, he immediately clapped both of his hands over his ears, squeezed his eyes shut, and began rhythmically tapping his left heel against the kitchen floor, a very specific, frantic physical tic to cope with sudden stress. My breath caught completely in my throat. I looked across the kitchen island at Arthur's coffee mug was hovering inches from his lips. His entire body had locked into an absolute paralysis. His face was no longer pale. It was completely bloodless, a hollow mask of pure horror. Because Arthur did the exact same thing. Whenever a server dropped a plate in a restaurant, whenever a sudden loud noise shattered the quiet of his office, Arthur would subtly clap his hands to his ears and tap his left heel. It was a unique behavioral trait that he claimed he developed as an anxious child. The false truth of our separate lives was beginning to fracture. "Arthur," I whispered, my voice trembling as the active investigation in my mind shifted into overdrive. "Look at him." Arthur didn't look. With a sudden, violent motion, he slammed his coffee mug onto the counter, spilling the black liquid everywhere, and turned on his heel to sprint back toward his study. "Arthur, stop!" I yelled, abandoning the roast and chasing him out of the kitchen, leaving Leo's middle of the mess. I followed Arthur into the downstairs hallway. He was moving with a frantic, animalistic speed, his hands shaking as he reached for the brass doorknob of his office. "What is wrong with you?" I screamed, grabbing his shoulder, forcing him to spin around and face me. "The rosemary, the tomatoes, the heel tapping. Arthur, he moves like you. He acts like you. Why did you look at him like you saw a ghost last night?" "You're losing your mind, Eleanor." Arthur roared, his voice cracking with a sudden, defensive rage that I had never heard from him before. He grabbed my wrists, his grip tight and desperate. "You're so desperate to be a mother that you're projecting my traits onto a random street kid. Stop analyzing the boy. Stop looking for connections that don't exist." He broke away from my grip and shoved his study door open. But as he stepped inside, the collar of his high-neck cashmere sweater caught on the sharp edges of the decorative brass door latch, with a sharp rip or open at the seam. Arthur stumbled forward into the room, but the sudden rip had exposed the bare skin of his upper back and neck. I stood in the doorway, my eyes locking onto the exposed flesh. Right there, at the base of Arthur's neck, just below the hairline on the left side, was a highly distinct, dark red birthmark, a sharp, geometric shape that looked exactly like a jagged crimson arrow pointing downward. My heart stopped beating for a full 3-second interval. Just 2 hours ago, while helping Leo wash his hands at the kitchen sink, the boy had tilted his head down. And right there, beneath his collar, on the left side of his neck, I had seen the exact same jagged crimson arrow. Video 21. The birthmark on the skin, Chapter 3. The secret on the skin, the jagged crimson arrow. It wasn't just a mark. It was a physical signature, a genetic stamp seared into the flesh. I stood frozen in the doorway of Arthur's study, my eyes of that dark red birthmark on his neck. My mind instantly flashed back to the kitchen sink, to the moment I had gently brushed Leo's unruly hair away to help him wash his neck. The exact same shape, the exact same placement, down to the millimeter. Arthur felt the cold draft on his exposed skin. He quickly reached up, his fingers frantically pulling the torn fabric of his cashmere sweater together, covering the mark. He spun around to face me, his eyes wide, darting around the room like a cornered animal calculating an escape route. "Eleanor, close the door," he ordered, his voice dropping into a low, menacing whisper that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "Who is he, Arthur?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a razor blade. I didn't close the door. I took a step, back into the hallway, away from him. The false truth of my stable, 12-year marriage was dissolving into a terrifying abyss. "I told you, he's a nobody," Arthur snapped, taking a step toward me, his hands clenching into fists. "A street kid you brought into this house to torture me. I don't know anything about his birthmarks, and I don't care. Tomorrow, you are calling the social worker. He leaves this house, Eleanor. Immediately." "No," I said, a sudden, fierce strength flooding through my veins. The active investigation wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a war for the truth. "He's not going anywhere until I get answers." I turned on my heel and walked away, ignoring his shouts. That night, the mansion felt like a haunted house. Arthur didn't sleep in our bedroom. I heard the distant click of the guest room door down the hall. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the frantic beating of my own heart. The pieces of the puzzle were spinning in my head. The gray eyes, the heel tapping, the aversion to rosemary, and finally, the twin crimson arrows. 3 a.m., the house was entirely dark. The snow had stopped falling outside, leaving a suffocating, dead silence. I slipped out of bed, wrapped my robe tightly around myself, and crept down the hallway. My target wasn't Arthur's room. It was the study. Arthur's office was his fortress. He kept it locked, but after 12 years, I knew the hiding place of the spare key, inside a hollowed-out vintage book on the shelf in the library next door. My hands shook as I retrieved the key, slid it into the brass lock of the study door, and turned it. Click. The door swung open silently. I stepped inside, the faint light of the moon casting long, skeletal shadows across his heavy mahogany desk. I didn't dare turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I pulled out my phone, using the screen's dim glow to guide me. I bypassed his architectural blueprints and went straight for the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, the one labeled personal and legal. It was locked. A paper clip from his desk dispenser, paired with a bit of leverage, popped the cheap lock after a tense 2-minute interval. My fingers flew through the folders. Tax returns, property deeds, bank statements. Nothing. Then, at the very back, my hand brushed against a thick, unlabeled manila envelope. It was sealed with old tape that had gone brittle with age. I carefully peeled it back and pulled out the contents. Inside was a collection of old, faded photographs. I held my phone screen closer to see them. The first photograph showed 2 young men standing in front of a half-built brick structure, laughing, their arms thrown over each other's shoulders. One was Arthur, looking younger, his hair entirely dark. The other man, my breath caught. He looked exactly like Arthur. A twin brother. I knew Arthur had an older brother named Thomas who had died in a tragic car accident before I met him, but Arthur had always refused to talk about him, claiming the grief was too heavy. The document beneath the photographs that shattered my world completely. It was a legal custody relinquishment form dated 10 years ago. It bore the seal of a New York family court. The name of the biological mother was listed as Sarah Kelly. The name of the biological father was Thomas Vance. And stapled to the back of the custody form was a certified copy of a birth certificate. Name of child, Leo Vance. Date of birth, October 14, 2011. My hands trembled so violently the papers slipped from my grip, scattering across the dark hardwood floor. Leo wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a random homeless boy I had rescued from the cold. He was a Vance. He carried the bloodline, the tics, the quirks, and the undeniable birthmark of the husband I thought I knew. Suddenly, the heavy silence of the room was broken by a soft rustle from the doorway. I spun around, dropping my phone, its light pooling on the floor. Standing in the open black study wasn't Arthur. It was Leo. He was clutching his oversized denim jacket tightly against his chest, his piercing gray eyes staring directly at the papers scattered around my feet. In his right hand, he was holding a small, crumpled piece of paper that he must have pulled from his backpack. "Eleanor," Leo whispered, his voice trembling in the dark. "Are you looking for my mom too? Because I found this in her old wallet before she died." He stepped forward into the dim light of my phone and extended his hand, offering me the crumpled paper. I took it, smoothing it out. It was a faded cash receipt from a Boston bank from 10 years ago, and written on the back in a frantic, elegant female handwriting were the words, "Arthur Vance paid me to disappear. If anything happens to me." Video 21. Skin Chapter 4. The DNA trap. The crumpled piece of paper in my hand felt heavier than a mountain. Arthur Vance paid me to disappear. The ink was faded, but the malice behind those words burned straight through my retinas. I looked down at Leo. His piercing gray eyes were wide, glistening with unshed tears in the dim glow of my phone screen. He didn't understand the complex architecture of the legal documents scattered on the floor, but he understood the raw anatomy of abandonment. "Leo," I whispered, my voice choking as I knelt to his eye level, carefully folding the receipt and hiding it in my robe pocket. "Go back to bed, sweetheart. I promise you, everything is going to be okay. I am going to find out the absolute truth." The boy nodded slowly, trusting me implicitly, and slipped back into the shadows of the hallway. The moment his bedroom door clicked shut, the warmth left my body. I wasn't just a grieving, childless wife's wife anymore. I was a woman executing an active investigation inside a fortress of lies. I didn't confront Arthur that night. If I confronted him now with a faded receipt and an old birth certificate, he would find a way to spin a new false truth. He would hire expensive lawyers, distort the geometry of the past, and force Leo out of my reach. I needed unshakable, scientific proof. I needed a trap so tight he couldn't wiggle out of it. The next morning, the sun rose over the white Boston snow, casting a brilliant but freezing light through the kitchen windows. Arthur walked into the kitchen at 8 a.m., his expression cold and distant, his high collar pulled tightly up to his chin to hide the crimson arrow on his neck. The social worker called, Arthur said flatly, refusing to look at Leo, who was quietly eating a bowl of cereal. There is an opening at a residential facility in Worcester. They can take him tomorrow morning. Fine. I replied, completely level, a chilling imitation of a compliant wife. If that's what's best. Arthur's eyes flickered with a sudden wave of relief. He didn't notice that my hands were clenched tightly behind my back. He didn't notice the absolute lack of emotion in my eyes. An hour later, Arthur left the house for a mandatory budget meeting at his architectural firm. The moment his Mercedes cleared the driveway, my trap sprang into motion. I walked straight into the master bathroom. I approached Arthur's silver shaving sink. There, resting on the marble edge, was his expensive badger hair shaving brush and his personal hairbrush. Carefully, using a pair of sanitized tweezers from my makeup kit, I extracted 4 thick, dark strands of hair from the bristles, ensuring the white root bulbs were intact. I slid them into a clean plastic Ziploc bag. Next, I walked into the guest bedroom. Leo was sitting on the bed, dynamically sketching a house on a piece of scrap paper, a terrifyingly advanced grasp of perspective and scale for a 10-year-old. Another trait of his father's bloodline. Leo, let me brush your hair before we go out, I said softly. He smiled and nodded. As I ran the brush through his thick, messy hair, I gently snagged 3 strands from the root. I placed them into a second Ziploc bag. By 10:30 a.m., I was driving through the slush-covered streets of downtown Boston. I didn't go to a standard state clinic. I drove to Beacon Forensic Laboratories, a private, high-tier genetic testing facility where my family's charitable foundation held a major seat on the board. I walked straight past the reception desk and into the office of Dr. Marcus Vance. No relation to Arthur, but a close personal friend who had helped me analyze my past miscarriages. Eleanor, what brings you here without an appointment? Marcus asked, rising from his chair. I placed the 2 plastic bags on his desk, along with a check for $5,000. Expedited comparative DNA profile, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping into a hard, unbreakable tone. I need to know the exact relationship between the biological material in these 2 bags. Marcus looked at the bags, then at the check, his brow furrowing. Eleanor, an expedited test still takes time. Usually 48 hours. I don't have 48 hours, I interrupted, leaning over his desk, my chest heaving. The child in that bag is about to be thrown into the state system tomorrow morning. I need the truth before the sun goes down tonight. Please, Marcus, use the high-throughput sequencing arrays. Run the short tandem repeat analysis. Do whatever it takes. Marcus stared at me for a long, heavy 3-second interval. He saw the desperation, the raw panic, and the absolute certainty in my eyes. He sighed, picking up the bags. Stay here. If I clear the forensic queue, I can have the raw markers analyzed. The next 5 hours were a descent into purgatory. I sat in the sterile, white waiting room of the laboratory, watching the snow turn into a dirty gray slush outside. Every tick of the wall clock felt like an active detonation inside my skull. At exactly 4:15 p.m., the heavy security door opened. Marcus walked out. His face was entirely devoid of color, his laboratory coat hanging loosely on his shoulders. He didn't say a word. He simply gestured for me to enter his private office. He closed the door, walked behind his desk, and slid a single sheet of paper toward me. I ran the 24 loci STR profile, Eleanor, Marcus said, his voice dropping into a somber, clinical whisper. The genetic architecture is absolute. There is no ambiguity. My eyes raced down the technical jargon, bypassing the complex charts of alleles and loci, until they landed on the bold conclusion at the very bottom of relationship probability, 99.99% conclusion. The allelic data confirms a direct, first-degree paternal relationship. The older male is the biological father of the child. The bomb had just exploded. Leo wasn't Arthur's nephew. He wasn't the son of his deceased twin brother Thomas. Arthur hadn't paid Sarah Kelly to protect a family secret. My husband, the man I had spent 12 years grieving with over our empty nursery, the man who watched me bleed and cry through 4 horrific rounds of IVF, was the biological father of the homeless boy sleeping under our roof. He had fathered a child with another woman while I was destroying my body trying to give him a family, and then he had paid them to rot in the slums of Boston. I held the paper tightly, my knuckles turning translucent as the false truth of my entire adult life fractured into a million jagged shards. I looked up at Marcus, my eyes turning from sorrow into a blazingness of rage. Thank you, Marcus. I snatched the DNA report off the desk, walked out of the clinic, and stepped into the freezing twilight. The active investigation was over. The confrontation was about to begin. Video 21. The birthmark on the skin, Chapter 5. The confrontation. The drive back to the estate was a blur of blinding headlights and dirty slush. The DNA report lay on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. My hands were perfectly steady on the steering wheel, my mind gripped by a cold, calculating clarity. 12 years of tears, 12 years of feeling broken and incomplete, all while the real architect of my misery slept in the same bed. When I stepped into the house, the grand foyer was dead quiet. The clock on the wall read 6:30 p.m. Eleanor. Arthur's voice echoed from the dining room. I walked in, deliberately keeping my heavy winter coat on. The dining table was meticulously set. Arthur was sitting, calmly scrolling through his tablet, a glass of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon in his hand. Leo was nowhere to be seen. Where is the boy, Arthur? I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. Arthur didn't look up from his screen. I had the driver take him back to the downtown youth shelter an hour ago. His paperwork was processed early. It's over, Eleanor. We can finally get our lives back. Get our lives back, I repeated, a low, humorless laugh escaping my lips. I walked over to the table, stood directly opposite him, and pulled the folded white sheet of paper from my coat pocket. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I flattened the DNA report on the dark mahogany wood and slid it across the table until it hit the base of his wine glass. What is this? Arthur asked, his brow furrowing as he finally looked up. He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the technical text, the loci data, and the bolded conclusion at the bottom. I watched his face. The human anatomy cannot hide a hit with absolute truth. The muscle in his jaw locked. The hand holding the wine glass began to tremble so violently that the dark red liquid sloshed against the crystal rim. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, the pupils completely dilated with horror. Eleanor, I can explain, he stammered, his sophisticated facade evaporating into a frantic, high-pitched gasp. This isn't what it looks like. It looks like a 99.99% paternal match, Arthur, I said, leaning forward, resting both hands on the table, staring straight into his hollow soul. It looks like while I was lying in a hospital bed weeping over a dead ultrasound, you were fathering a child with Sarah Kelly. It looks like you paid her a fortune to vanish into the slums so your pristine, wealthy life wouldn't be ruined by a scandal. No, you don't understand the geometry of what happened. Arthur roared, slamming his fists onto the table as his chair screeching against the hardwood floor. Sarah was a mistake. A one-night stand during our 3rd year of marriage when we were fighting constantly about the fertility clinics. She got pregnant. She threatened to destroy my firm, to destroy us. I didn't abandon Leo out of cruelty, Eleanor. I did it to protect our marriage. I paid her to leave Boston so we could have a fresh start. The false truth was trying to build a new wall. He was spinning his treason as an act of devotion. To protect our marriage? I whispered, my voice dripping with pure venom. You let your own flesh and blood freeze on a plastic crate in a soup kitchen to protect your reputation. You watched that boy tap his heel and mimic your exact tics in our kitchen, and your only instinct was to throw him back into the gutter before the world found out your secret. He is a liability, Eleanor, Arthur yelled, his face turning a furious shade of crimson, the high collar of his sweater shifting to reveal the jagged red arrow on his neck. Finds out I have an illegitimate child with a debt addict. The partnership is gone. The estate is gone. Everything I built for us dissolves. There is no us, Arthur, I said, my voice dropping into a freezing, definitive tone of finality. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled bank receipt Leo had given me. I threw it directly into his face. You told me your brother Thomas died in a car accident before we met. But Leo's birth certificate says his father was Thomas Vance. You didn't just hide a child, Arthur. You stole your dead brother's identity to sign those legal papers 10 years ago, so your name would never appear on a public registry. Arthur froze, his hands hovering in the air. The realization that I had fully mapped out his architecture of deceit completely paralyzed him. He sank back into his chair, looking small, broken, and utterly defeated. I'm calling the driver, I said, pulling out my phone. I am bringing Leo back to this, and tomorrow morning, my lawyers will file for an asset split divorce. You are going to sign over this house, half your firm, and a full trust fund to that boy. Or I will hand this DNA report and your brother's stolen identity documents straight to the federal prosecutors. Arthur looked up at me, his eyes wild with a sudden, desperate realization. A terrifying, twisted smile slowly broke across his face. You think you won, Eleanor, he whispered, his voice shaking with a chilling, quiet malice. You think you can just bring him back? Look at the time. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 6:45 p.m. The driver didn't take him to the downtown shelter, Eleanor, Arthur said, leaning back in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. I knew you were investigating me the moment you left for the lab. I had my security team move him. Right now, Leo is on a private transport heading out of the state. By midnight, he'll be in a private, unlisted facility in Canada under a name. You will never see that boy again, and you will never prove a single thing. The confrontation hadn't ended. The real battle for Leo's life had just exploded. Arthur's twisted smile was a monument to his own arrogance. He sat there, swirling his wine, fully believing he had engineered the perfect geometry to erase his sins. You think you're the only one who can map out a strategy, Eleanor? Arthur sneered, leaning forward. My security team does exactly what I pay them to do. The boy is gone. You have a piece of paper, but you have no child. No victim, no case. I stood there, looking down at him. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. Instead, I slowly reached into my winter coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped the screen to end a live audio broadcast. From the shadows of the dining room hallway, the heavy footsteps of two men echoed against the hardwood floor. Arthur spun around in his chair, expecting his driver. Instead, his eyes Detective Harris from the Boston Police Department, followed closely by a high-ranking state social worker, stepped into the dining room light. Harris was holding a police-issue receiver, which was still buzzing with the live audio of Arthur's full confession. Arthur Vance, Detective Harris said, his voice a solid concrete wall. You're under arrest for interstate kidnapping, child endangerment, and identity fraud. Arthur's wine glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the mahogany table, mirroring the destruction of his corporate fortress. Eleanor, you set me up, he choked out as the handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. I didn't set you up, Arthur. I simply anticipated your architecture, I said, my voice completely devoid of pity. I knew you were tracking my car. I knew you'd panic the moment you realized I went to the forensic lab. So I didn't just call Marcus, I called the authorities. The security team you hired to move Leo? The transport agency you called? I intercepted the wasn't your team, Arthur. That was the state police escorting Leo to a secure federal safe house. Arthur was dragged out of the mansion, his elegant leather shoes scraping against the floor, his screams of desperate denial fading into the cold winter night. 3 hours later, the storm outside had completely cleared, leaving behind a pristine, silent blanket of white snow. I sat in the warm, brightly lit living room of the safe house downtown. The fireplace crackled softly. The door opened, and Leo walked in, still wearing his oversized denim jacket. He looked at me, his piercing gray eyes searching my face for any sign of the storm we had just endured. "Eleanor," he asked softly, "am I going back to the shelter?" I walked over to him, kneeling down on the plush carpet, and took both of his small, calloused hands in mine. "No, Leo," I said, a tear of pure salvation finally slipping down my cheek. "You are never going back there. You are for good." His dynamic, dimpled smile broke through his cautious face like sunrise over the ice. He threw his arms around my neck, burying his face into my shoulder. As I held him tight, the fabric of his jacket shifted slightly, exposing the base of his neck. I looked at the jagged crimson arrow on his skin, the mark that Arthur had tried so hard to bury in the dark. But as the firelight caught it, it didn't look like a curse anymore. It didn't look like a scar of betrayal. The false truth of my broken, empty life had been violently dismantled, revealing a beautiful, hidden architecture underneath. Arthur had built a fortress of lies to protect his reputation, but the universe had used a simple act of kindness to bring his son right back to the only person who would truly love him. The birthmark wasn't a stamp of shame. It was the roadmap that had finally brought the Midtown Research Phys's venture capital firm was a massive, sterile tower of black glass and brushed titanium that loomed over the city like a dark monolith. At exactly 9 p.m., the building was completely dark, save for the penthouse floor, which glowed with a cold, pale white fluorescent light against the rainy night sky. The streets below were completely empty, washed clean by a freezing downpour that kept pedestrians trapped indoors. I walked through the grand, marble-lined lobby of the tower, the sharp sound of my high heels clicking against the stone floor, echoing like a countdown timer toward his doom. The private security guards at the front desk looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and cold distance. They had received their master orders. They swiped a security card and directed me to the private, high-speed elevator that led directly to Charles's executive laboratory suite on the 45th floor. As the elevator doors slid open silently, I was greeted by a sprawling, minimalist environment of white quartz floors, brushed titanium walls, and floor-to-ceiling glass panels overlooking the glittering, rain-soaked grid of Manhattan. In the center of the main laboratory room stood Charles, surrounded by multi-million-dollar genetic sequencing arrays, centrifuges, and sterile steel workbenches. He was holding a sleek, black leather folder containing the final surrender and custody documents. Directly behind him was the entrance to his private experimental vault, a high-security, reinforced steel room sealed by a massive biometric palm scanner and an alphanumeric digital lock system. That vault held the master digital servers containing the experimental cell-masking blueprints from Switzerland. "You look incredibly pale, Victoria," Charles said, a cold, predatory smile cutting across his sharp face as he laid the black leather folder flat on a pristine white quartz counter between us. "But I suppose you're a biological ghost within your own family can have that effect on a person's demeanor." I stood 5 feet away from him, my hands tucked deep inside the pockets of my long, dark cashmere coat. Inside my left pocket, my fingers were tightly clutched around my smartphone, which was actively broadcasting a live, high-definition audio and data feed directly to Dr. Marcus and a specialized team of white-collar crime investigators waiting in an unmarked surveillance van parked 3 blocks away. "Before I sign my entire life away to you, Charles," I said, my voice completely shedding the fake panic and desperation I had used on the phone, turning into a cold, level steel that made his smile slightly falter. "I want to hear the truth from your own mouth. I want to understand the genius of the man who managed to rewrite my own blood." Charles let out a short, arrogant laugh, leaning his hands flat against the quartz counter, looking down at me with absolute psychological doubt. He believed he had won the war completely. And a winning general loves nothing more than to boast of his flawless strategy before the execution. You want an explanation for the science, Victoria? Fine, I'll give you your closure, Charles said, his voice sharp and confident, echoing off the sterile glass walls. Your father was an old money dinosaur who thought a simple DNA clause could protect his $500 million empire from a modern mind. He wanted to ensure that only a pure Vance could touch that wealth. So, I used his own paranoia against him. I didn't need to fake a test at the bank. I simply utilized your routine iron deficiency treatment 6 months ago to perform a targeted bone marrow chimera graft. I injected you with a highly stable, synthetic stem cell matrix developed in Zurich. It overwrote the cellular blueprint of your blood and saliva. The bank's machines didn't lie, Victoria. They read exactly what I programmed your bone marrow to tell them. 0% match. You Mao Dan, an imposter, inside your own skin. Chapter 7. The concealed broadcast. The air in the laboratory grew colder as Charles spoke, his voice filled with the twisted pride of a scientist who believed he had rewritten the laws of nature and law to achieve the ultimate theft. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting his words hang in the silent air of the penthouse suite. And what about Leo? I asked, my voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet whisper as I stepped closer to the quartz counter, my eyes locking onto his. What about my son? Did you manipulate his blood too? Leo is exactly who he has always been, your biological son. Charles laughed softly, tapping his heavy gold pin against the leather folder with an irritating, rhythmic click. He carries your original Vance DNA. But because your blood and saliva now carry the synthetic laboratory sequence from Zurich, the maternal comparison algorithm reads as an undeniable mismatch. Tomorrow morning, when I present your signed confession and the bank's official DNA files to the Supreme Court judge, the state will strip you of your parental rights, award me sole legal custody of the child, and grant me full operational control over the $500 million Bloodline Trust as his legal guardian. It is a complete, bloodless corporate acquisition. And the best part? It is entirely legal according to every medical scanner in the state. It's a beautiful, terrifying architecture of deceit, Charles, I said, a slow, triumphant smile finally breaking across my face as I pulled my right hand out of my coat pocket. But like every overconfident venture capitalist, you failed to understand the structural integrity of your source material. You focused entirely on the fluids of the body because you are fundamentally lazy. You assumed that because the bank and the courts test blood and saliva, controlling those two vectors was enough to win the war. Charles's predatory smile completely vanished, his eyes narrowing with a sudden, sharp nod of suspicion as he looked at the complete lack of fear on my face. What are you talking about? Your blood is compromised. You have no legal legs to stand on in any courtroom in this country. The data belongs to me. I don't need my blood to destroy you, Charles, I whispered, reaching up to the base of my neck and pulling a sleek, high-definition digital storage drive from my collar. While you were busy boasting about your chemical engineering for the past 10 minutes, Dr. Marcus Vance was utilizing the live data stream from my hidden microphone to bypass your network firewall. The moment you admitted the specific Swiss patent numbers, the corporate names, and the dates of my bone marrow graft, your unique vocal frequency matched the administrative security subroutines of your own network. We didn't just record your verbal confession, Charles. We just downloaded the original, unmodified genetic master blueprint agent directly from your private lab vault servers. Charles's face turned into a sudden, pale mask of absolute shock and primal panic. He lunged violently across the quartz counter, his hands reaching out to grab my throat, his sophisticated executive composure completely fracturing into a manic, desperate rage. You crazy bitch, Charles roared, his fingers missing my neck by inches as I stepped gracefully backward toward the elevator bank. I will erase that data. I will have my security team lock this entire tower down right now. You are not leaving this building alive with that file. I wouldn't worry about your security team if I were you, Charles, I said quietly, pointing to the grand glass windows behind him that overlooked the Manhattan streets. Before Charles could take another step around the counter, before his trembling hand could even touch the internal security alert button under his quartz desk. The floor-to-ceiling glass panels of the executive suite were blinding, flashing red and blue lights of a dozen federal law enforcement vehicles screaming into the midtown courtyard below, blocking every single exit. Chapter 8. The law enforcement intervention. The heavy, reinforced security doors of the elevator bank blew open with a violent mechanical crash that echoed through the sterile laboratory. A specialized federal task force from the Department of Homeland Security and tactical officers from the New York Police Department's white-collar fraud division stormed into the penthouse suite, their weapons drawn, their laser sights painting bright red dots directly across Charles's chest and forehead. They did not hesitate or ask questions. Two heavy tactical agents tackled Charles to the white quartz floor, slamming his face into the polished stone, twisting his arms brutally behind his back as heavy steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. Charles spat a mouthful of blood and broken glass onto the floor, looking up at Hare with eyes filled with a venomous, desperate hatred that burned through his remaining sanity. "You think this saves you, Victoria?" Charles screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, manic panic as the agents lifted him forcefully to his feet. "Go ahead. Take that audio recording to the New York Supreme Court. My legal team will file an immediate motion for total evidence suppression before the sun rises. You recorded me without a judicial warrant on private corporate property. This entire sting operation is an illegal, unconstitutional setup. The digital file is fruit of a poisonous tree, and you know the law. I will be out on bail by midnight, and your bank trust will still remain frozen because your blood still reads as 0%. I walked calmly over to the quartz counter, picked up the black leather folder containing his useless surrender documents, and tore them completely in half, letting the shredded pieces flutter down onto his bleeding face. "You scientist, Charles, but your massive arrogance made you a complete legal idiot," I said, my voice dropping into a cold whisper that froze the remaining air in his lungs. "I didn't bring the federal agents here to win a civil custody dispute with an audio file. I didn't need your consent to fix my blood or prove my lineage." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a certified, federally sealed forensic medical report developed by Dr. Marcus Vance in New Haven just 6 hours ago. "This is a deep tissue hair follicle extraction and a deep dental pulp biopsy report, Charles. Unlike your temporary bone marrow graft, the DNA inside my hair root matrices and my deep tooth roots was formed when I was a fetus in my mother's womb. It is structurally, biologically insulated from your synthetic Swiss chemicals. Dr. Marcus successfully extracted the pure, untouched, original Vance genetic sequence from my tissue. When compared to Leo's DNA, the comparison algorithm is an absolute, mathematically undeniable 99.99% maternity match." Chapter 9. The federal charges. Charles's eyes widened into giant circles of pure, paralyzing terror, his skin turning a sickly, pale grayish-green under the harsh tactical lights as he stared at the federally sealed document in my hands. The reality of his complete destruction was finally sinking into his calculated mind. "The federal agents are not here for a marital dispute or an asset division battle, Charles," I continued, leaning down close to his ear so only he could hear the absolute finality of his doom. "They are here because your Swiss biomedical startup used unauthorized, unregulated human gene editing compounds on an American citizen without judicial or FDA clearance. That is a direct violation of the International Biosecurity Act of 2024, a federal felony that carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 40-year maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Your entire venture capital firm and all your private medical assets are being frozen under the global anti-terrorism and biosecurity statutes as we speak. You aren't losing a divorce case, Charles. You are losing your freedom for the rest of your natural life." Charles's legs completely gave out beneath him, his body going limp as the federal agents dragged him toward the freight elevator. He wasn't a sophisticated venture capitalist or a conquering general anymore. He was a broken federal prisoner wrapped in cheap steel, his entire empire destroyed by the very science he had weaponized against his own family. His personal assistant, his crooked accountants, and the corrupt hospital administrators who had helped orchestrate the medical cover-up at the Manhattan Private Pavilion 5 years ago were arrested within hours in a synchronized citywide sweep. Faced with federal biosecurity charges, they did not hesitate to sign frantic to the United States District Attorney in a desperate attempt to secure non-custodial plea deals. By Friday morning, the presiding New York Supreme Court judge, presented with the unsealed federal biosecurity indictment and Dr. Marcus's unshakable hair follicle DNA report, instantly dismissed Charles's custody petitions with prejudice. The court issued an absolute, permanent protective order against him, restored my full legal identity, and completely unlocked the $500 million Bloodline Trust, transferring total operational control of the Vance real estate assets into my hands without any further restrictions. Chapter 10. The Untouchable Lineage. Now, I stand alone in the grand, amber-lit library of our Upper East Side estate, the same room where my father used to sit and map the future of our family skyline. The heavy, comforting scent of premium tobacco and old leather-bound volumes still lingers in the air, a iron-willed patriarch who built this empire from nothing but dirt and determination. Leo is sitting on the plush Persian rug near the roaring fireplace, quietly building a massive model skyscraper with his wooden blocks, completely unaware of the storm that almost swallowed his life. He looks up at me, his sharp, analytical hazel eyes catching the warm glow of the fire, and smiles. A beautiful, pure smile that carries the unmistakable, genetically pristine heritage of 3 generations of Vance. The human body is an incredibly complex, beautiful piece of biological architecture. The fluids in our veins can be temporarily manipulated, our skin can be lied to, and our saliva can be rewritten by desperate men who wear expensive suits and wield sterile needles in dark laboratories. But the core of who we are, the deep, quiet truth embedded in the skeleton of our history, can never be erased by a thief. Charles tried to ghost inside my own home, but he forgot that a ghost is the most dangerous predator of all when it finally learns how to break the cage and hunt the living. The $500 million inheritance remains exactly where it belongs, within the untouched, sovereign borders of our family name. Here at Family Truths, the biological code of betrayal can be as complex as a Swiss laboratory patent, but the truth will always find a way to bleed through the lies, even if it has to strip you down to the very root of your soul to do it.